Hello, everybody. Welcome to, I think this is the 49th episode of Beyond Talking Points, if I remember correctly, with Matt and Matt. Today, we're going to, so recently, I think it was like 6 days ago, was the 1 year anniversary of the COVID-19 lockdown, when the situation, or when people felt like the situation was started to get out of control, and schools had to close and restaurants had to close. Everyone had to stay quarantined, stay in their house or apartment for quite a long time. So, I mean, congratulations to everyone for getting through a year. But what we wanted to do for this conversation was just give some of our, I guess, final thoughts. I mean, the situation isn't technically over, but it does seem to be like it does seem like we're out of the woods in terms of the more drastic measures that were being taken place, and some of the worse, some of the more horrendous outcomes related to COVID-19. But by the way, just in case anyone is listening to this podcast, when I said thank you for or happy, when I was saying congratulations for getting through the year, I wasn't trying to undermine, or I wasn't trying to dismiss the people, the over 500,000 deaths in the United States, or I don't remember what the number is worldwide, but just to be clear, I wasn't trying to undermine those people who have suffered greatly this year. But anyway, I was a little worried about this conversation because I was a little worried about this conversation because I wasn't quite sure how it was going to go. We did a coronavirus policy episode several months back. I think it was the longest episode we did. It was close to like 3 hours or something. And that was basically, I didn't push back much on what Matt said. I did near the end of the episode, but for the most part, that was Matt's episode. It was his. He wanted to put forth his case the best he could for his criticisms of the policies the government was laying down. So I for a while we were thinking we were also going to do an episode where I did that, where I kind of did a similar thing, and we never got around to doing that. So I guess this is going to be my time to kind of give some thoughts, and then Matt will bounce off that for about an hour or so. I've come to the conclusion, or I've come to kind of think that my opinions related to coronavirus really don't matter. And so that's the basis. That's how we're going to really start this conversation. It's a weird place to start the conversation, I know, but I just don't really know. I think it's very difficult. So this is going to be me kind of extrapolating to kind of broader issues. We can get more specific when it comes to COVID-19, of course, but we just live in a time period when people are far. I guess one way to think about it, Matt, this is a flippant way to put it, given my co-host politics, but social cohesion is kind of shattering. So people do not people do not believe. There's less agreement among individuals, and even in the same community. Now, of course, you can make the argument there's always disagreement throughout history, and that's true. But there's time periods where people are in certain communities are more or less willing to agree or disagree on certain matters, and they're much more likely to, in certain like time periods, people are less likely to disagree on certain fundamental things. So we don't live in that kind of time. We live in a time when people are more than willing to disagree about pretty much every possible issue you can think of. I guess to put it like metaphorically, it's like there's some people who would disagree that the sky is blue, if you know what I'm saying. And so I just really don't know, or rather I struggle to kind of have these conversations because I just don't know where the best place to begin having those conversations is. Neither of us are doctors. Neither of us are claiming to be doctors. Neither of us are claiming to be epidemiologists. We're obviously not experts in all the the mechanism behind COVID-19 and all certain biological or chemical laws that go behind that kind of crafted the pandemic. So, and at some level, I need to trust the experts. And I know we had this conversation, I think it was one of the Michael Malice episodes we did, about kind of when do you trust experts? When do you not trust experts? When Michael Malice is criticizing experts, who is he talking about, excuse me. And while I'm not going to name drop specific organizations and say they are or are not reputable. But when it comes to medical matters, I don't see I don't see how I cannot trust the experts. I don't see how that really makes sense. I don't really see how I what leg I have to stand on in that sense. So at this point, I really just don't have many opinions on the coronavirus, just because I don't know if I'm qualified to have too many opinions. And what people are often, like the medical community generally has a lot of, there's a great amount of consensus among the medical profession. That doesn't mean there are people who do disagree on certain issues. There's always disagreement on every single issue ever. But from what I understand, a good portion of the medical community believes in or was advocating for a good portion of the regulations that the governments were enacting. And so again, it's like, well, I don't see how I can argue against that unless I'm just arguing against it from the perspective of, well, any government oversight or government regulation or control of my life is bad. But of course, and that's kind of your basis. So I can see how you get to where you are. But I don't have that same basis. So that's probably, I think there was another point I wanted to make, but I've been rambling for a little bit. So that's a good place for you to jump in here.
So I think what you're kind of getting at is that there are like two arguments that I'm almost sympathetic to that are pro the way the government reacted to coronavirus. And I think that the two arguments, so the first one is the one that I was, I guess, more sympathetic to at the very beginning, but I don't think it holds ground very well. And it's kind of like, we don't know what's happening, so shut everything down. It's one of those things where we don't think it will end the world, but there's a chance it could. So the only thing we could do if it's going to end the world is shut down. That was argument number one. And I think if somebody operated under argument one, it wasn't valid after maybe May or June, just based on empirical data that came out from other countries in terms of if our experts were basing off that. There was I remember in March, I was talking about how there was data from Greenland and the mortality rates were super low. And I was saying, are we really locking down over all these testing and all this widespread data from it was either Iceland or Greenland, and it was showing how low mortality was. So it's okay, clearly it's not this thing that's going to kill 20% of Americans. So that was off the table quick. So the second argument is kind of that I think you're kind of hinting at to some degree is I like comparing it to this unfortunate event that happened in the town adjacent to the one I grew up in El Cajon, California, where a Black man was getting accosted by police, or the police were telling him to, they wanted to arrest him. They heard he might have a gun. And of course, what the guy did was he turned to the cops and he started pulling a piece of metal out of his pockets, and the cops shot him. Of course, what he had didn't end up being a gun. Weirdly enough, it was something else, some other metal object that would look like a gun, and the cops are going to shoot you before you can shoot them if they think you're pulling out a gun. So it's one of those things where, well, he didn't have a gun, so they shot an unarmed guy, but it looked like it could have been a gun. So if it was a gun, people would have been happy the cops shot him first. Well, hypothetically, in a different paradigm where people are, I guess, more nuanced, people would be willing to cede to some extent that it's more okay if the guy had a gun on him and was about to shoot the cops for the cops to shoot him. That's kind of how I feel like the approach you're taking is almost an analogy. I think that's a strong analogy for it. So a lot of the policies that we've enacted can seem very stupid now that we've had the information, but we couldn't have known it at the time. I'm a little sympathetic to that, because there have been all these arguments of people saying, well, it seems like we need to slow the spread because based on certain models, if we overwhelm hospitals, more people will die, and we don't want to overwhelm hospitals. Unfortunately, well, I would say fortunately, but some could say unfortunately, I don't think the data has bared out that any of the things that the United States did mattered really at all. And I cited an article from the Wall Street Journal. Well, there was an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal that cited a lot of reporting. But if you look at the numbers for Florida compared to, say, California, Florida had a completely different lockdown regime after May or June of last year. They stopped locking down as strictly. They started opening up indoor dining way earlier than most states did. And if you look at their charts and you look at the deaths per capita or the case per capita, there is no real difference. So the lockdown policies did not do anything. If anything, my takeaway is the opposite of your takeaway. And I see this all as another example of how experts tend to fail. Experts tend to take a lot of sides on issues, and a lot of people who are credentialed experts are absolute hacks that get things completely wrong. And I'm not saying that experts aren't worth appealing to, but I'm saying experts should be examined very harshly. And if you want to make a decision, you should probably look to the experts, but then you should scrutinize the experts. And to me, it doesn't seem like they were scrutinized. Like, I think public health as a field, and this is my takeaway, is they're kind of a joke. A lot of their predictions didn't pan out at all. A lot of their policies that they suggested didn't make any different from any natural example we can look at. And it seems like they had a very unnuanced way of suggesting policies. It was, we suspect that if we close these things, then less people will develop cases. And since there's less cases, that is good. But they don't account for anything intangible, like anybody's basic rights to make decisions for themselves. It didn't give people the opportunity to say, I'm at a significantly lower risk than old people, so I should be allowed to go to a bar. And it's like, no, we want to do a one size fits all authoritarianism. We want to take away anybody's ability to do anything that they feel comfortable doing. And we're not going to account for any other excess deaths that could occur because a ton of people are losing their jobs, or because a lot of people are hopeless because they can't do anything with their lives. So it was very unnuanced. They are highly specialized in one thing. All they measured was the one thing, and they gave policy proposition, or they gave policy ideas based on one thing, and then it turned out bad. I'm really excited for whatever book gets written about how the lockdowns were failures, in the next couple of years, because I'm sure there's going to be one 400-page book that's going to show every single failure, and it's going to give all the data. But I think this is going to go down as one of the biggest governmental failures of my lifetime, and I'm pretty confident about that at this point. But yeah, I agree that we're at the end of the tunnel, but I think there is a lot to criticize, and I think you can give the benefit of the doubt to them. But I think there's a lot wrong that they did.
So, I mean, first off, where I agree with you is when you mentioned that, experts need to be scrutinized. Everybody needs to be scrutinized about everything, basically, is my position. There's no person, I think, there's no person on the planet who's perfect. There's no person who knows everything. So no matter who you're talking to, whether it's a doctor, or chemistry professor, or mechanic, I mean, that you take what they say, especially on certain issues, with a grain of salt. But you can even take what they say about their chosen field, their profession, with a grain of salt. I mean, that's basic, like, critical thinking skills. So I would totally endorse what you said there.
I would say you shouldn't take that for granted, though, because the government clearly didn't scrutinize the experts in this situation. I'm not saying that to be like loose with my words. They enacted policies that have never been tried because the experts told them to. And if you look at Florida versus California, it didn't work, and it wasn't scrutinized.
Well, I mean, this is kind of why I was a little wary to have this conversation, because, I mean, I'm just not. I know myself. I know I'm not. Let me put it like this. I mean, you've done more research on the topic than I have. So there's definitely issues involving the situation that you know of that I do not. So I'm just at a real disadvantage. I haven't had the time, or I guess desire, to really look into the matter very thoroughly. I probably should, if I want to be if I want to look at the coronavirus from a more like academic perspective, you could say. But so, I mean, this is just kind of the roadblock I guess I have in my own mind. I'm going on, I guess, the limited knowledge I have. Most of it comes from, what everyone else knows, and I've seen a few sources here and there that maybe the mainstream media doesn't talk about. So I'm a little more, I know a bit more about it than say Joe Smith, who just watches Fox News 24/7, or an MSNBC, or whatever news source you want to insult here. Um, but I mean, you're just in a position, you feel confident, like, no, I've looked at the information and I think I see holes in what the arguments are, what the experts are saying. And what I'm saying is, I don't see those holes. Part of that is my lack of research. And part of it just is what information I have taken in, what information I have learned. It's made sense to me, in any particular moment, given what I knew. Um, I mean, and on top of that, I think when doctors and medical experts are, their job is completely preventative at some level, or not completely preventative, but that's what they're always aiming for. They're aiming for preventative care. They're aiming for, making sure, like, trying to stop something before it happens. So if you develop type 2 diabetes, there's nothing a doctor can do. They just have to give you medication and tweak your diet, tell you to get more exercise. They just have to deal with the symptoms in that moment. But the goal, of course, would be to prevent the patient from getting type 2 diabetes in the first place. So this is kind of, I mean, you could say this is speculation on my part, but if I'm thinking about, if I were a medical expert, there's an unknown virus, that was just introduced, or that was discovered, in China, and it started to spread, and the symptoms are very unpleasant, and they can be deadly, in fact, for certain groups of people, the elderly, and people with pre-existing conditions, and so on and so forth. Um, I can understand why the experts would have said, okay, well, on the safe side, we're going to shut down. Now you dismissed that line of argument with a metaphor, earlier, but I just think that's kind of how the medical profession works. So I can't really criticize it on that basis. But I guess when we're talking about this, there's really two conversations. There's kind of the conversation about, like, the data. Did the policies work? And that goes back again to what role do the experts, what role do the medical professionals have to play in all of this, and how much do we listen to them, and how much do we criticize them? And then there's the political question, and I guess I'm much more comfortable discussing the political question because I just know more about it. Um, but as we're having this conversation, that's just two different areas to keep in mind.
And I'll keep that in mind, and I'll keep that in mind too, because I could do another 3-hour episode that would be an updated version of the one we've done in the past. But there's no reason to relitigate that, because our interesting conversations are where we both, I guess, are comfortable with things. So I'll reposition. But I guess I would say there are charts out there that show all the different policies that are tried in all the different states, and most states had similar trends in terms of case increase or mortality increase, regardless of what they did. And it seems like none of the things like mandating masks in a state were really correlated with anything. But that goes to the data, and that's kind of like not what we're usually about anyways. So I shouldn't expect you to be familiar with that. Instead, I think that there are some things worth tackling. And something that's worth tackling, and I think this goes to our views of policies and politics in general, is I mean, at this point, I'm an anarchist, but that's not the norm. The ethos of anarchism and thinking that government should be abolished is a little out of the norm. But the ethos of, I guess, of certain conservatives, and I guess the idea of libertarians in general, is that there is a very high bar of proof that needs to be reached before you do government action. Now, I accepted the point that in March, people could be very scared because they didn't know what was happening. There wasn't a lot of good information. I kind of ceded that. But the issue is the data quickly revealed that old people were the people who die. Obese, overweight, and old people are the people who die the most. the reason why Florida's death rates, I hate to go back numbers, but this is just an example that illustrates that. Florida has a very elderly population. And one of the reasons why their death rate was lower than California and New York is because they targeted certain policies around elderly care. So they took certain precautions that other states didn't to make sure the people who were actually at risk didn't get exposed to the virus. So the archetype I always like to refer to is like Andrew Yang, where Andrew Yang comes out there as like a technocrat and he tries to imagine not just a welfare program, but the one that's like the most efficient. So like that's why he likes UBI so much, is because if you don't means test it, you can cut all this overhead costs that doesn't go to people. It's just jobs of people deciding who gets things and doesn't. So he's like, okay, here's the efficient way of doing it. Well, if you have any kind of ethos about being, I guess, skeptical of putting in government rules, it became very clear that there were certain subsets of the population that should be most protected if you're going to use the levers of government. And what I saw is frightening to me, because I saw something more reminiscent of shock politics, of emergency politics. It was immediately turned into a crisis. And then they used it to justify any overreach imaginable when there are clear demographic groups that are more at risk. And it's not just something that I would say is bad and, oh, look, the government failed. But I think this is something that is genuinely like concerning and should be alarming to people who think that the government, that government abuse is, or totalitarianism is something that should just be like, kind of, we should be concerned about. Because very, very quickly, it was like old people are the ones who die. Other people get kind of sick. A lot of people don't even get sick if they are carriers. How should we move on from this? But it was one size fits all, and the fear mongering has been applied to everybody equally. I know people who are younger than me that have no pre-existing conditions and are skinny, and they are terrified. And they and it's not because they're going to go see their family like that weekend and they don't want to get their family sick. It's because they think if they get it, they'll probably die or something, or they'll at least be like deeply, deeply sick. So I think when thinking about this through the lens of like shock politics and not necessarily abuse of power, but I guess it's the government took one thing, right? It's kind of like, I mean, it's a bad comparison in the sense that everybody makes it, but coronavirus getting compared to 9/11, they took one event and they used it to justify all kinds of unrelated things. And you can look at the $1.9 trillion stimulus that just passed. Most of it wasn't about the coronavirus or even about reopening. A lot of it is all kinds of things that Democrats or big government people have wanted for years. So I'm afraid of it just from a shock politics angle now that we're coming out of it, because it was a state of emergency that was intentionally vague and it wasn't used in a precise scalpel way that maybe Andrew Yang or a technocrat would argue the government should be. And it's kind of like the worst excesses of what I guess I fear. So maybe that's the way to kind of think about it a little bit.
Actually, that's a good point to bring up. Actually, it's so this kind of bookends a couple podcasts. The very first podcast we did on coronavirus, I think you brought up that exact question. So I'm glad you brought it up. And I'm going to do something which I don't often do, which is kind of use a libertarian talking point to get my own point across. I'm going to use a minarchist, Ayn Rand type talking point to get my perspective across on, I guess, government oversight and whether or not, or when certain policies are or are not justified. So a minarchist, if someone doesn't know, believes in the minimal government. And basically the phrase I was going to use is they believe in a government that protects against major externalities. So a minarchist would say, well, we need the U.S. needs a government because France could invade us tomorrow. So we need that government to protect us from that French invasion. And that's sort of, I guess, how I view the levers of power in our current. That's how I view the levers in power in general. But given our current, sociopolitical landscape, I'm willing to cede the moral legitimacy of government policy if I think it will protect against those certain major externalities, and if it will better the lives, if we can see that it betters the lives of the inhabitants of this or that country. So that's really where you and I differ. And I really don't see, and I guess I'm much less alarmed by the coronavirus policy from the perspective of like, does that is that like, does that mean we're inching closer to a totalitarian like government? I mean, we're not going to get into whether the government's a totalitarian or authoritarian right now, but I don't really see like at some level. I guess I look at coronavirus policy and I think that's exactly how I expect a government to act in the situation. So the government takes these, what the majority of experts say, and they enact those policies because that's what the experts are saying. And they're enacting them. They're enacting them across the board. They're not just saying, well, if you're working a old folks home, you have to wear a mask and social distance and whatnot because more old people are more likely to get mortally ill and die from coronavirus. They enact them across the board because, well, I mean, you could think of it either from a benevolent perspective of, well, at some level the politicians are trying to help us, or you can look at it from the cynical perspective of, well, I don't want Jill, whose 21-year-old son died from coronavirus, I don't want her to campaign against me for re-election if I don't protect her son from coronavirus. So whichever view you take, I guess I see that as, oh, that's just government acting like government. Now that's not that statement in and of itself, or that argument in and of itself, is not necessarily in defense. It's not necessary. You don't necessarily have to go along with that argument to defend coronavirus policy. But that would be my response to whether whether or not I find it alarming. Which
I think I agree
don't.
with you. I think I agree with you, but I think that's why I find it alarming, right? Is because I think it's exactly what the government would do. They took the event, they took the potential fear that was there, and they maximized it and turned it into this giant political football. And they're using it to shoehorn in all kinds of things that they wanted to do anyways. That they're using it to justify. I mean, I would use it to justify my political priors too. I mean, everybody's doing that right now. But they're using it for their own gain, and it doesn't really matter if the evidence reflects it or not, because the narratives around it are so strong. And this kind of goes to one of the things that's big in libertarian circles right now, is they're all really unhappy with how the LP ran in 2020 because they didn't really talk against lockdowns. And it's not really, I mean, if you poll people, it's a very polarized issue, but Republicans weren't really trying to lift lockdowns till very recently. Only Florida was the one that really did it. I mean, Texas had a bunch of lockdowns still. A lot of consistently red states were locked down. So it wasn't even an issue that like half the country was doing it and half wasn't. It was just a couple states separated themselves out. But yeah, it's been totally turned into this tool to push legislation in ways that you'd expect politicians to do it. Now, I don't think it was necessarily a smart political strategy in the same way you would, right? Because if the people who are familiar with the empirical data wouldn't really be worried about a person knew a young person that died, now they're going to hate me, because that actually is just so increasingly rare. But I think it was they can force certain narratives, and now that narrative is shaped, like you tell people that you're afraid of the disease, even if you're in a relatively safe group, you shouldn't leave your house. Well, now a lot of businesses need the government's help because now all these industries are dying, and now the government can push a $1.9 trillion package, and like 30% of it is actually direct payments to people who are hurting, and they got to do like over $1 trillion of stuff they always wanted to do. And I'm not saying they intention. I'm not saying that it's like purely malicious, because a lot of people in government believe that even like 20-year-olds are deeply at risk, and a lot of 20-year-olds believe they're at risk. But a lot of it is, oh, look, here's a narrative that's presented itself. Now passing stimulus is a football. And this is what we see of like why the negotiation for the last bill has lasted like 2 months. It's because how much can we get through? So I mean, I think that's the rational way to look at it. And it's cynical, but I think that that's true. But I think that's why it's scary, is because now there's so much more on the table. I think this is something that really threw people who are like my parents' age off, is because they hadn't really seen a government say all these businesses have to be closed down indefinitely. And you just have to deal with it. Like all the movie theaters in Philadelphia closed for like 8 months, and you don't know when they're going to open up. They might open up, like the governor could come out tomorrow and say, hey, they're open on Monday. Or they could say they're going to open up in 2 months from now. They're open now, fortunately, but there was a while where it was just indefinitely closed. So that type of unilateral, I guess, policy was something that was kind of foreign to the United States, at least for some amount of decades. And it's not something we've seen. So now it's kind of like a new thing that is, I guess, on the table. And that's what I find kind of alarming. And I know you'd say, well, I expect governments to put things on the table because governments kind of want to control things. But I mean, it's scary to see it grow in real time, I guess.
So I guess I think my argument goes deeper than that. So to go back to, I mean, the data, the numbers, what little I know. I mean, again, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, we passed over 500,000 deaths in the United States alone. There's been more, like, is it over a million in worldwide? I think. I don't remember the exact number. It might be, but I think at least over a million, maybe even a couple million. I'd have to look at that again. But but then you mentioned, like, well, you know, a young person doesn't really have a risk. It's like, well, again, if I'm thinking about it like a medical professional, everyone has a risk when it comes to something like COVID-19. Now, again, you and I are young. We're going to have much less of a risk than, say, my 85-year-old grandfather. Or if I had asthma, I would have much more of a risk. But everyone has a risk. So I don't think it's just disingenuous to say, well, young people don't have. Not that you're necessarily exactly saying that, but just to clarify, it's not disingenuous to say young people don't have risk. It's they have much less of a risk than other groups of people. But
I would say that anybody listening should look up the breakdown of, like, say, deaths per 100,000 for each age group. And unless you're very familiar with the numbers, you'll be very, very, very shocked by how low it is for every group below age 65 plus. That's all I'm saying. You can make up your mind if it's a low risk or high risk. Anybody can make up their mind. But if you look up those numbers and then you reflect on the policy for last year, I'd say it's pretty shocking. That I could be the anomaly who thinks that, but I would just say look at the numbers. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying I would recommend people do that. That's all.
well, again, I wasn't saying high or low risk. I was saying risk, just period. Everyone has a risk of. I mean, I have a risk to, and I'm
Well, I
just
have a
making.
risk walking on my sidewalk.
I'm making
right?
an esoteric point. I know,
Yeah,
but like
yeah.
I have a
agree
risk
with that
of.
esoteric
I have a
point.
risk of getting hit by a bus if I walk down the street. You know what I'm saying? So it's like I'm just making that clear. But I so when I think about coronavirus policy, I guess the place where I start is I think the government had to have done something. And again, if you're starting from the premise of, well, government is evil, I don't want the government to do anything because I don't want the government to exist, then my argument just breaks down entirely. But I don't see, if a government is going to exist, and again, a government does exist at the moment. We live under a government. Most people live under governments in around the world. So governments exist. Again, and I start from the presupposition, okay, well, I'm willing to use them to a degree in certain contexts to do certain things because I think the alternative is worse. And when I think about coronavirus, I just think to myself, well, the government had to have done something. Again, it's an infectious disease. I don't think it's right to say, well, we should have just. I don't think it's necessarily right to say. And again, you're not making this point, but someone could say, well, we should have just let it kind of run its course. I don't think that would be. I mean, I think we would be in a far worse position in terms of the numbers globally and in individual countries if we had just said just let it run its course without any government intervention. Um, and then the thing is, I think for the policies to have been for the policies to be the most effective. And again, I know you've read it, you've looked at the numbers and come to the conclusion they're not effective pretty much. But I think for the policies to have been effective, you have to universalize them. I don't think, I think the deaths again would have been even more if we had just said, if we had just said only for people around old folks, only old folks have to wear masks around the house or around stores and restaurants. Only if we had only if we had minimized the policy to affect only a certain group of people, I think that would have decreased the effectiveness overall. Um, and I mentioned this in the very last episode we did when we were talking about, you know, this, whether the state is justified. I think there are certain situations where collective action is necessary. And I guess I just don't see, I guess I don't see the argument for against collective action in the context of an infectious disease such as COVID-19. But again, I haven't done as much research as Matt, so you can take what I say with anyone who's listening can take with what I say with a grain of salt.
I think what you're saying is very appealing to a lot of people who have base assumptions that are kind of the left, right? And it's not because you're a leftist, but it's because if you tested your like your priors, then you'd come off more likely as somebody who's a lefty than a right winger. But I think a lot of people are sympathetic with those kinds of that way of thinking about it. I would just say I think everything you said is really baseless. Which and part of that is just my priors are different than yours. But I just think bearing out what happened, that there's no reason to think any of the policies had to be universalizable. Because when places didn't do things in a universal way, they had the same results as the other places. I think at first when we last talked about it, I'd suggested that if anything would only work if it was very, very, very authoritarian. And you can look at places like Australia, where they were fining people for driving in their car if they didn't have a pass that allowed them to leave their house. And you can argue that Australia did some things right and they were like, quote unquote, back to normal. And since they were able to be in that stasis till a vaccine was created that supposedly is going to work pretty well, then you can argue that Australia's policy could have been justified because they managed to have enough compliance because they were authoritarian enough to fine people thousands of dollars for leaving their house. You can make the argument that worked. So I guess I'm not as dismissive of that argument because I just haven't heard much more than what I'd heard back then, and I'd kind of said that piece. But at this point, I think our policy was about as effective as somebody saying you should let it run its course. And I think the one of the main, I guess, scientific things I would appeal to is the idea of how you get immunity from any disease. And what essentially happened was nobody got immunity for a really long time. If you look at like in the summer when everybody that was like the height of lockdowns, that was actually when cases were really low relative to, I guess, this winter. But what was happening was nobody was developing any kind of immunity because they were locked in their house and the disease hadn't actually spread that far. So to some extent you were containing it, but to some extent the numbers were still growing. It was more of just seeping into the population slowly. So if you had it more open and people did their own risk assessments and, people could decide if they want to put themselves at risk, you'd have the people building immunity because all sorts of people built immunity by getting it and not even knowing they had symptoms. We stopped that from happening. And it's harder for a disease to burn itself out if less people have immunity, because you can imagine like if you have an infectious disease that is somewhat contagious, then for every person who gets it, 1.5 people might get it. But if you have a society that has 80% immunity, then it's not going to give 1.5 people that disease on average. It's going to give it to like 0.8 because a bunch of people already have antibodies. So what we did is we kind of kept societal, quote unquote, societal immunity artificially low by keeping people in their house. But we could have been building that up for all the people who weren't actually at risk. And by weren't actually at risk, I mean, if you look at the death toll, because I had to pull it up, but people under 50 make up 20,000 deaths in the United States since the coronavirus started. Of the 494,000, based on this data from as of March 3rd, 2021, of the 494,000 people who died, 20,000 were under 50. Those 20,000, so only 20,000 people died in those age range. That's like not a negligible amount, but a ton of people got coronavirus. All those people weren't building immunity. So the transmission rates are going to be artificially high if you let society, start going out, because nobody has antibodies. Well, if you just told the people who are at lower risks, which was pretty available at the time, to say, hey, you guys should be more cautious. You guys don't have to be as cautious. There's still some risk. You have to make your own decisions as a human being. Well, then it can be sussed out, and then you're just going to have more immunity in a society. So I just don't see that more people would have inherently died from COVID if we all stayed inside longer and were more authoritarian, or I don't see why things would have gone better if the United States operated, I guess, differently in more of a statist way. Or and if they were like, if everything was like Florida and it just said, hey, let's only enact policy about old people, and then we'll be up in front about this information with people, I think it would have turned out about the same. And I'm not saying that just to be a jerk or contrarian. That's genuinely, when I look at the numbers, and I've seen some stuff from like Reason Magazine on like the unfortunate term that has now been seen as a slur, as like herd immunity. I think everything was mishandled in a deeply important way. But I'm sorry if I'm getting into the weeds of numbers, because I know that's not the direction you wanted to go. I just felt like that's the only rebuttal to what you said, because you're making a big point, and I will say I can understand why somebody would say that, and I can understand why somebody would be sympathetic to that. But I almost think that's the problem, and I think that's kind of what makes me black-pilled, is people hear that and they'll say, yeah, what are you going to do? That's what governments are going to do. It should be unilateral. It's infectious. And it's like, I don't think it's that simple. And I think that's the cover for authoritarianism, me being locked in my house, a ton of people losing their job, a ton of people losing their businesses, a ton of people killing themselves. Like, I think that all happened because of that kind of basic reasoning, and then trust the experts. And that's the terrifying part, for me at least. And that's kind of why it all makes me so, I guess, black-pilled.
I guess to go back to kind of the question of whether coronavirus policy will have any effect on government oversight, government power in the future. I guess maybe you could. Well, I guess what I would want is for you to kind of lay out either, signs that you see of things getting worse, the government getting more and more power, becoming more and more totalitarian, authoritarian, whatever phrase you want to use. Because for the most part, I mean, things are slowly but surely going back to normal. I don't really see, I don't see the government saying, and this is like the most simplistic argument. This is me putting it in very simplistic terms, so I'm not trying to be flippant here, but I don't see the government saying, well, we're just going to be this way forever. You're going to have to social distance from now on. You're going to have to wear a mask from now on, indefinitely, no question about it. It's done. It's over with. You can't question us because the experts say so. Again, flippant, a very, very simplistic argument. No one's actually saying, no one's actually that dumb, but let me finish quickly, and then I'll let you respond. I see things going back to normal, relatively speaking. Restaurants and bars are opening up again. More and more stores are opening up again. People, the government is working. I mean, for all the government's flaws, I think both state and both local, state, and national governments, they're working incredibly hard to get vaccines both produced and distributed, and that's not an easy thing to do. So, I mean, the government is working very hard on that, and I think we have to give them credit and give everyone else, and like everyone involved in that process, not just the government, everyone involved in that process, we need to give them a lot of credit. Also, the mental health, the medical professionals who are working on that as well, the researchers, everyone's working at as fast as they can to get vaccines out there. So I see a lot of effort to get things back to as normal as we can get them. I don't really see the opposite happening. Now, of course, I guess someone could make the argument that they can't do it right away. They have to gradually increase power over time until no one notices. That's a possibility. Um, Again, I guess I just don't see, given the current policies, given the state of our government, I don't really see the signs that it's going to get much worse. I did want to make a point about herd immunity, but I'll let you respond to the previous point, and then I'll make my other point.
Okay, so a couple ways the government overreach has been established. So one, this one I get to plug my other podcast I do on my own, which is the Obey podcast. But I did an episode. It was based on an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal written by Mitt Romney, and I don't like Mitt Romney, and I don't agree with him on anything. But the whole reason why I think I used to be a Republican is because I'm okay with criticizing Democrats. And a lot of times they give a good criticism on the Democrats' policies, and then they proceed to tell you the crappy thing they want to do. So so the end of his op-ed is awful because it's what he recommends instead. But at the beginning of the op-ed, he points out it's on the $1.9 trillion stimulus. And he pretty much is talking about how almost none of it has to do anything with coronavirus. They essentially created a new entitlement program for people based on the amount of kids they have. And it's only temporary, but the whole insider, the DC insider crowd, and then the reporters from DC on NPR, and then people at Politico, they all suggest that this is what Democrats are going to be running on in the midterms, is making sure that this new it's like a monthly payment direct to your account based on how many kids you have. They want that here to stay. So they've stealth created like a new entitlement under the guise of coronavirus. So that's like one of the ways that you could argue that they've done overreach based on coronavirus that is distinct from coronavirus, but it's using coronavirus as cover. The other point is that you were directly addressing is how things are opening up now. So I pray to God, and I don't believe in a God, but I pray to God, if there is one, that you are correct. I hope everything opens up. I'm sick of this. I've been sick of this since a week into 2 weeks to slow the spread. I've been over it. But I get concerned because okay, so as a joke yesterday, I Googled the phrase "COVID is over." I just threw that into Google, and I threw it in my phone again because I remembered the results made me laugh. Because when you scroll past the news and then you scroll past the COVID-19 alert, here's FAQ. The first result is the coronavirus is here to stay. Here's what that means from a magazine, Nature, on February 16th. Then if you keep scrolling down just a few more, it was saying, I guess I might have gotten slightly different results now than this morning. But then there was one, is COVID going to end by the end of 2022? Or will COVID still be with us in 2022? And stuff like that. So this is something else I've also covered on my other podcast. But it's one of those things where, and this isn't to be too, I guess, conspiracy oriented, but politics is clearly a game of narratives. And because we know that a lot of political agendas are based on what people think they can get away with pushing, it kind of makes me concerned because you'll hear about variants of the coronavirus that the vaccines are slightly less effective against. They'll only maybe have 75% efficacy instead of like 90% against a certain variant. And then you hear people doomsay about that. And it's kind of like, well, there are two ways the government can go. Which one does the government want to do? Does it want to keep us afraid because we're more afraid of variants? Does it want us to be concerned with the minority of people who aren't going to get the vaccine? Or is it going to say, no, we're all good because most people have gotten vaccinated and we know who's actually at risk now? And I don't really have a lot of faith that the government's going to do the one that is pro-freedom and pro-liberty and anti-lockdown. It looks like that's what we're trending, at least in the short term. So I hope you're right. But that's a concern because now the government set the precedent that states are very much allowed to lock down if they decide or they want to argue that it's necessary. And if they have the power to do it, they can do that. And then if another disease comes along, it can have as low of a death toll, which I'm not to say 500,000 is low, but if it's a small segment of people in specific demographics, then I mean, it's not like 10% of people were dying, and that's how they acted. So I'm just saying now I'm afraid that this is on the table, and now every person and every business has to act like this is on the table. That's the overreach. That's the concern on at least that second segment.
Let me make my other point I was going to make, and then I'll respond to what you said just now. So for the question, is coronavirus going to stay? Is it going to be like the flu and the cold? Is it just going to be, in the wintertime now it's possible you're going to get COVID? And that's very possible. Again, I would have to look at the data. But I don't think that necessarily invalidates the arguments I'm making, because and you've already, I mean, you basically said you conceded the point of kind of ignorance in the moment, kind of basing policy on just complete lack of knowledge in the moment, because there was no knowledge of coronavirus back when it first started. There's very little knowledge anyway. But I mean, I think it would appear to me that the worst effects of coronavirus, at least in the short term, are a thing of the past. Again, COVID's still with us. Vaccines, and most people still haven't even gotten the vaccines. And so, I don't know, of course, even if everyone's vaccinated, that doesn't necessarily mean coronavirus will go away. Diseases don't really go away, so to speak, but they go away effectively. Or like, if you just think about it from, well, how many cases are there? But they're still technically out there in the world, or as biological entities. But I mean, if we have effective vaccines, then I don't think it's going to be an issue anymore to be like, well, like at some level, herd immunity is less relevant in that case if you get vaccines, because then if you get vaccines and you make sure that as many people as possible have the vaccines, then it will be similar to various other diseases that at one time were a huge toll on societies, and now are no longer they no longer have the negative effects that they once did. They might still, for some people, of course. Some people still die of pneumonia, but we have better, more effective ways of dealing with pneumonia if you get
Can I
pneumonia.
ask a
So
question,
you're
though?
less likely to die from pneumonia in 2021 than you would have been in 1921. Go ahead. There was another point I also wanted to make, but I'll let you ask your question.
So based on all that, though, because I agree with you, but the concern I'm having, and this is why what I'm not sure if you're concerned about, is the willingness to use a narrative that is relatively inaccurate. Because I think everything you said is true. I just don't think that would stop people from pushing a narrative if they had enough to push it. So now that we've already had enough people go along with lockdowns and be okay with lockdowns, and a bunch of people mad at the other half of the country for not being happy with lockdowns. And we do know that COVID variants is something that is kind of in the air. And our vaccines might be slightly less effective. And oh no, maybe a bunch of people are anti-vaxxers. What are we going to do? Well, the people who wanted it got vaccines, so maybe they shouldn't even be scared. But aren't you a little afraid that the malicious neoliberal media we talk about might push a narrative that's only a little bit true? Because you and I would both agree on a lot of things, a lot of narratives they push that are kind of true, but mostly not true. And they use to push things you and I both don't like. So is that concern not in your head for these types of issues? Because that's why I'm getting kind of hung up on here.
I suppose the issue is less. I suppose I'm not thinking as much about the issue because I am more sympathetic to what the experts are saying on the matter, and the government policies that the experts said that most experts said we should do. I don't think. So I'm not going to be very. Yeah, I think that statement stands. I really don't quite know how to expand on it, to be honest. Well, I guess I can expand on it a little bit. So, I mean, both of us, one thing we have in common, of course, we're both very critical of, here's a buzzword, the media. And when we say the media, we're both critical of Fox News and Breitbart, but we're also critical of NPR, MSNBC, NBC. And again, going back to the very first point I made about critical thinking, I think it's very important to be critical of the media. I think it's very important to analyze the arguments the media is putting forward, the narratives the media is putting forward, try to understand why they're making those arguments. So in order to, see if they're justified or not. Often the narratives the media pushes are not justified. But again, at risk of repeating myself, I guess I haven't had too much of an issue with the media's narratives behind the coronavirus, because I think because of my opinions on or because of what data I've interpreted or what data I've seen. I think a good portion of the policies made sense. Now, I think the issue when it comes to like the media and scientific research and whatnot, is they're too quick to pounce on stories. And I think the John Oliver did a little episode on this, where he basically says, well, journalists need to stop publicizing every scientific paper they come across, because then there are 100 scientific papers that contradict that. They're not the people watching the Today Show don't necessarily have the background to analyze whether that paper that the media cites is or is not correct. And so we need to be much more careful. Journalists need to be much more careful. Political commentators, TV personalities need to be much more careful when they're citing particular scientific studies, especially if they don't have a background in science. So I agree with that. And when the media is using scientific knowledge, scientific research, in a way that I think is either scientifically inaccurate or immoral, I guess I'm willing to point that out. I just don't think in this particular context I've seen that much of that. But before you respond, I wanted to go back to your point about Mitt Romney's op-ed and the stimulus checks. If that's true, if the coronavirus, if the COVID-19 pandemic makes Democrats go more to the left, then I'm happy about that. As anyone knows who listens to this show, I want to see the Democrats go more left. I'm very well, and my issue with the stimulus checks is it's not enough. that's my issue with the stimulus checks. My issue isn't, I don't want the government to give me.
Okay,
let me finish.
I brought it up to mention government lying though, because they're passing it under guise, and that's clearly not their intent. So I know you agree with it, but the point isn't if you like it or not. The point is, how do you feel about this clearly being an example of government lying? Because I'm making the broad point about when they're going to use stuff that you don't, they're going to take a narrative they're going to use to lie about something that you don't agree with, like the Patriot Act or something. It's the same thing as that. It's, hey, here's a situation. We're going to pass an act because of it, even though it doesn't have anything to do with it. And then guess what? It screws you. So I know you like the government spending in these ways, but it doesn't. That's not what I'm alarmed about.
So, well, I mean, first off, the issue with, it's not just me saying, I like stimulus checks, we should pass them, and I'm going to use whatever methods necessary to pass them. The issue was, at the time, it seemed like lockdown was the best option. We went there. It hurt the economy. It meant that people were either laid off. They couldn't work as much. They couldn't earn as much money. They needed help to pay the rent. Many landlords were not very sympathetic to their tenants. Well, I can't work right now due to COVID-19. Well, I'm sorry, you can't stay here then if you can't pay the rent. So again, going back to the very first point about the silly libertarian quote, it's like, I guess it's not silly libertarian quote if I agree with it. But going back to the libertarian quote, it's like, well, yeah, the economy was affected by COVID-19 and the policies enacted, and people were in a very difficult spot in terms of finances. And so I'm more than willing, from a moral perspective as well as from a practical perspective, to say, okay, we need to pass a stimulus check. We need to get people the money in order for them to survive, in order for them to pay their bills, in order for them to get the necessary food and to have as normal lives as possible. I don't see. Let me finish.
Okay. No, you're not answering my question. I want to rephrase it so you can answer it.
I don't see where
let's talk about education spending. Let's talk about education spending. The government says, we're going to put $40 billion in this bill for education because schools have to reopen. Guess what? $3 billion of those dollars are going to be spent this year. The other 90% of the education spending is going to be spent in years 2 through 10 from now. So they say, we need to pass this package to give schools money to open because of coronavirus. But 10% of the education spending in the bill going towards those schools will be spent in the next year. The other 90% isn't for reopening due to coronavirus, but it's passed under the guise of we need to give them money to open right now because of coronavirus. So they're lying to you. It doesn't matter if you agree with schools needing more funding. I mean, it does in terms of like your Machiavellian calculus. But the point I'm getting at is the government is saying one thing and they are doing something that you cannot justify as what they are saying, because 90% of it isn't what they're saying. Even if you're in favor of it, it's still hiding the ball. So what I'm saying is this is an example of hiding the ball. You can argue the stimulus checks are because some people lost their jobs. A lot of people who get stimulus checks aren't really any different positions than they were last year or the year before that. But that's a separate argument on policy. I'm more saying there are clear examples in this bill of them hiding the ball and lying about it. And that has to be grappled with if you're somebody who's in favor of big governments, because they use the narrative to do something. But most of what they're doing, and like, here's the education example, they aren't doing what they're saying they're doing. They're lying to people. So it's like, is that just a sunk cost because you expect them to do it? I guess that's a fine example. I mean, that's a fine answer. That's probably what I would say if I was in your shoes. But that's something that has to be reckoned with. That's all. That's all I want to get across.
I think I don't see. Okay, it's hard to know where to take this. I was just about to to answer your very question. So because I guess what I was about to say was I don't really see where the line comes in. You specified where you see the line came in, so now I know we're on the same page. But I guess I don't. So okay, we had so we did an episode a while back where we talked about like SCOTUS, talked about the Supreme Court nominations and just other like ideas, because and we were just having a conversation really about whether, or I think you were actually having making a point about the media, but it was from the perspective of like what politicians do, how they act, how you don't like the way they act, and you were using the Supreme Court nomination as a jumping off point. And I remember coming up with the phrase principled on principleness to, and I said, well, you know, the Republicans don't fight fair, so I'm willing to fight fire with fire because that's the only thing they recognize. So I could say, and I think it would be justified, coronavirus is an externality. I think you can be. I would, if I were an active politician right now, I would say, okay, this is a difficult situation. I think certain policies need to be enacted in order to fight it. But here's the thing. I mean, like, I think those at some level, some of those policies should have been enacted anyway. And it just so happens that at some level, some people are saying, well, darn, you know, the COVID happened. Well, now we have to do something. And so, I mean, I guess you can make the argument that, yeah, it is making people, coronavirus indirectly is making people think outside the box, making people think more about policies that perhaps they wouldn't have thought of before. So because the situation has changed, we were faced with a new problem, and so more other policies are going to be put forth to face the new problems. Now, at some level, I don't really see Democrats going that far left or much farther left than they were. Maybe they're inching a little farther left in certain areas. They're definitely not as left as I want them to be. So I am critical of the Democrats for the exact opposite reason that you're doing, or I'm critical of the Democrats for a different reason than you're critical of the Democrats, because I don't think they're doing enough. But now, again, what I think you're talking about there really is how is the media framing the issue?
And
no. Let me finish. So let me finish. So, and this is a matter of like both, I guess, how corrupt the media can be, and then also just general human laziness. So the article you mentioned about a certain amount of money going to fund education for due to coronavirus. But technically, and it's not all about coronavirus, it's about other things, and it's going to be over a 10-year period. This is like where I put on my Jon Stewart cap, and I'm like, well, I'm just critical of the media in a different way than you are, because they're giving you the facts. They're just being lazy in their presentation of them. I mean, and again, to be a little cynical about it, I expect the media to be lazy in how they're writing articles and presenting these things. I try my best to get more information and not just take what is being fed to me. But I don't see it as politicians and the media are lying to me in this scenario, in that particular example, but just in general, I see it as both to a certain degree, Democrats are being empowered by the situation. Again, I think they're being empowered in very moderate ways. So really, at some level, not at all. But even if I agree with you, the Democrats are going more left due to coronavirus. Again, from a practical perspective and a moral perspective, that's a good thing. I'm willing to I'm willing to take the situation as is, and in the hopes of fighting for my ideals. That's kind of what it means to be a politician or a political activist or whatever. And I don't think the media or politicians are lying to you in the way that you think they're lying to you.
So I'm not saying this about you intentionally, but I'm saying about the argument you're portraying. And I would say everything you just said was what was I almost okay. So I know you agree with it. Everything I was trying to say wasn't about whether you agreed with it or not. That was not even a thing I was trying to touch. I don't, and maybe this is just because of how much news I consume and how many politicians I listen to and how much news media I listen to. But if you have been paying attention the last 2 months in terms of everything about the 1.9 trillion dollar stimulus, and you consume it and you think of it as it being lazy as opposed to it being lies that are intentionally done because they want a certain narrative that makes the bill more popular, then I would say you're blue pilled. And I don't do that. I don't say that lightly, but I think on this situation that's like the most blue pill take is saying, oh no, they didn't explain how wonky the bill is. It's like, no, a fraction of this bill is related to coronavirus. The majority of the bill isn't related to coronavirus. And it's that is a objectively factual statement that anybody reporting on this knows. And they don't care because they agree with it. And I think we might have to agree to disagree on that. But if somebody's been listening to NPR and things like Joe Biden's speeches and hear this in the language of it being a rescue bill, and they actually examine what's in the bill, then there's no way it's not a lie. And that's fine if we're going to agree to disagree there. I'm okay with that. We do need to wrap up, but I'm very comfortable saying that. I'm more comfortable saying that than almost anything I say on any of the episodes of the show. That's how comfortable I am with it. So I just want to make that very clear that if we disagree there, that's okay. But I think it is outright lying. And I think it's very transparent if people want to dig into the bill and then dig into how it's been communicated by politicians, then that's okay. But it's very transparent lying to me too. That's why I'm not willing to chalk it up to bad reporting or just trying to be not careful. It seems like it's obviously lying and misleading intentionally for political gain. So I just want to make that clear. But we should wrap up so you can go ahead and then I'll send us home.
So really, just three really quick sentences or statements I just want to throw out there. One, if anyone's curious, any audience members are curious, talking over each other and trying to get the other person to back down is very typical of the podcast. Doesn't mean we dislike each other or anything. You're a great guy, Matt. So no one has to be worried. We're gonna never do another episode after that. But the jokes aside, so I mean, I think I'm willing to say that I am blue pilled when I'm using when I'm using those that term in the Michael Malice sense. And I think that was made perfectly clear when we did those 2 episodes on Michael Malice, one on moralism and politics, and the other on specifically his definition of the red pill, to what it means to be red pilled. And this goes back to just the differences between our presuppositions that we're starting with. I think the Michael Malice type way of thinking is a bit too quick to look for. Well, I think it's too quick to either be on the attack mode from a moral perspective, but it's also too quick, I think, to see kind of conspiracies or to see, if you don't want to use that word, it's someone like Michael Malice is just too quick to kind of look for look for like certain influences that certain malicious influences that are causing X, Y, or Z to occur. So I mean, I can't think of a better word than conspiratorial. Really, it's a very, at some level, very simplistic kind of way to look at human society. I'm willing to say I'm blue pilled, but I'm blue pilled specifically because I think to be red pilled in the Michael Malice sense is verges on an absurdity. I don't see the evidence to think like Michael Malice does. And then just the last thing I'll say, and you can wrap up the show. After talking to you about this issue, I'm actually very interested to look at all the data myself and try to come to any conclusions on my own, whether I think you're right or not right, or where we agree or disagree. So that is definitely, we said we would do it kind of an episode like that in so long ago, like I mentioned in the beginning of this episode. But that is definitely something you've sparked my interest, Matt, is what I'm trying to say. So that is definitely something I'm willing to do in the near future. If you just give me a couple weeks or so to kind of scour the literature, maybe a month or so, give or take, to scour the literature and actually talk about it from using numbers, using the data. I feel bad to get on to record an episode and be like, well, I can't really analyze the data, guys, because I haven't done the research. I feel like I've kind of failed my duties as an American citizen on that front. But yeah, so I think that wraps up what I wanted to say for this episode.
Got it. Well, and it's always hard to agree to disagree and leave things there, but I'm doing my best. As always, I think part of why we've been able to do 49 episodes is because we always manage to there's never really a good stopping point and there's always more stones to uncover. And yeah, I was pretty pissed there because I was like, I'm interpreting this completely differently and I don't feel like he's answered my question, but like I do that all the time to you, so I can't hold that against you very much. You've been a good co-host for 50, 60, 70 hours of content, and we've managed it so far.
I'm filing a divorce.
Yeah, you're right. So on that note, I hope you guys enjoyed listening to this one where we went back and forth on quite a few things, and hopefully it was food for thought. And that concession for Matt that he's actually wants to look at the data and maybe talk more is a bigger win than I usually get on this podcast. So I'm content with that to wrap things up. If you want to find more episodes, you can find us on your podcast feed or on YouTube. We have a channel with all the videos of the episodes uploaded. It's just listed as Beyond Talking Points. You can find more of me on Twitter at the Obey Podcast or at Matthew T. Keck. And as I alluded to during this episode and just now, I have a podcast called the Obey Podcast where I just kind of do solo rants. Like I looked at that Mitt Romney op-ed and I kind of I think I read through that one mostly paragraph by paragraph and pointed out like the things I was seeing there and where he was right. And then how in the end, Republicans still suck and they're still trash and I still would never support one. So that's the kind of fiery, hate, vitriol-filled content that everybody needs more of in their life because we want more polarization. And you can find us more stuff from Matt here. He has his personal YouTube channel, The Anti-Philosopher, and he does some vlogs and he will commentate on things that are interesting. And is there anything you want to add before we wrap up? Okay, perfect. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed. We'll be back next week, and signing off for now, it's Matt and Matt.